Everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are going to have a very exciting conversation about a very important topic. And as you see, the title of our stream tonight is Does Money Corrupt the Soul? Before we dive in, let me tell you a little bit about myself. If this is the first time you're watching, my name is Marte. I run a financial advisory firm called Abundant Advisors, and I'm a certified financial planner. I've been in the financial services business for over a decade, and my firm specializes in helping Christian professionals and Christian retirees to manage their wealth wisely. And this program and the content that we put out on all of our social networks strives to help you figure out the heart behind your money. And you might wonder, why would a financial advisor talk about topics like this? And that is one of the reasons why our firm is different from other firms. Whereas most advisors really worry about your portfolio and how much return you can make in a year and how much income you can make out of your assets. We definitely worry about that and we take good care of your assets, but we also talk about the heart behind the money issues that are actually going to lead you to have a more abundant life. And that is the theme of our firm. That is the theme of all the work and the content we produce. And we hope you enjoy that. Now, when talking about how to connect with us, before we dive into the topic, just make sure you check out our Facebook group, Abundant Money. In that group, we give early access to our viewers and listeners on the podcast on all the topics that are coming up down the schedule. You get an early peek at what's happening. We get your feedback. You have an opportunity to influence the content that we put together. So definitely take a look at that. And tonight, because this is a live stream, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to participate, talk to us. So feel free to use the chat. If you're on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, you can use the native chat platform. And we are going to be able to look at your comments. Tonight is also our first time transmitting to Instagram. You'll be able to see our video, but you won't be able to interact with the rest of the viewers through the chat. So if you want to be part of the Q&A, make sure you tap the link in the bio, go to our YouTube channel and watch the stream from there so that you can also see what's happening and be part of the conversation. Now, tonight's topic is going to be a bit of a controversial subject because in our society today, we love to bash on wealth, bash on the rich, while at the same time, we also aspire to build wealth and to make a name for ourselves. So it's this interesting dichotomy between, we aspire to do something, but we also love to pile on against it all at the same time. And, as I was thinking about the subject tonight, it crossed my mind that we don't have enough people talking about this topic, about money and the effects that it can have on your soul, on your life, on your mind. And tonight's topic is really going to be about helping you figure out what does this mean and how to prevent any harm from coming to you from money, possessions, or wealth. Now, recent domestic policy developments in the United States have sort of put this at the forefront, right? So our new president has rolled out an expansive domestic agenda that hinges upon taxation in order to be able to afford the programs that the administration wants to implement. And inevitably, whenever there's a conversation about new taxes, the most obvious area or the most obvious group of people to tax more of is, of course, the rich. And, you can have a different of opinion. We might be like-minded in our opinion about the subject, but the subject tonight is not talking about the virtues, the good or bad of tax policy or who should be taxed and how much that should be taxed. That is a topic for a different night. And we might actually talk about that at a different time in the future. But tonight's conversation really is about understanding the true effect that money has on you. Not on taxes, not on your neighbor, on you and your heart. And this conversation is really for everyone. Some of our conversations are aimed at, people who are professionals and are working and building wealth. Some of our conversations are more specific to retired people that have already accumulated a certain amount of assets. But this conversation is for everybody. You may find it interesting. You may find that you relate to it if you aspire, or if you've already reached a certain level of success. I think this topic is going to apply to both of you. I love starting our conversations with a guiding principle, and my guiding principles 99% of the time are going to come from the Bible. And everybody probably at this point has heard this famous verse that money is the root of all evil, right? Well, let's take a step back. It's typically said as money is the root of all evil, but in reality, the verse actually says, for the love of money is the root of all evil. And that verse is actually in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. But what's most interesting about this conversation and this particular verse is actually what comes before that and after that. And we so often narrow our attention on one little piece of the scriptures, but we miss some of the context that's coming behind and after that. So we're going to read that together. 1 Timothy chapter 6, the section about money and wealth starts in verse 6, and it says, "Yet true godliness with contentment is itself great wealth. After all, we brought nothing with us when we came into the world, and we can't take anything with us when we leave it. So if we have enough food and clothing, let us be content. But people who long to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many foolish and harmful desires that plunge them into ruin and destruction." And here comes the key verse. "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And some people craving money have wandered from the true faith and pierced themselves with many sorrows. But you, Timothy, are a man of God. So run from all these evil things. Pursue righteousness and a godly life, along with faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness." And I'm going to repeat, it comes from 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6 through 11. Wow, that was a lot of reading there. And there is a lot to unpack about those verses. But the key message that I want you to leave with here is that there is something going on in your heart between you and your relationship with money that is going to be a critical indicator of what the outcome of this conversation is going to be for you. Money in and of itself does not have any morality. Money in and of itself is neither good nor bad. But it is our relationship with money that influences how we look at life, at other people, and even impacts how we look at a relationship with God. Now, we're going to take another step in a different direction, but we're going to come back to this biblical concept. And I was reading an article on the Washington Post about how being rich wrecks your soul. We used to know that. The authors of this particular article have very strong opinions and actually back those opinions with a number of sources, which, to be quite honest, I did not go and verify every single one of the studies they cite and all these different sources that they quote. But I'm just going to take the article at face value, and I want to show you and hear what the authors have to say about this conversation on money. Here's an excerpt from the author's opinion about wealth and people. He says, "The point is not necessarily that wealth is intrinsically and everywhere evil, but that it is dangerous, that it should be eyed with caution and suspicion, and definitely not pursued as an end in itself. That great riches pose great risks to their owners, and that societies are right to stigmatize the storing up of untold wealth." The authors of this article from the Washington Post are Charles Matthews and Evan Sandsmark. And they go through a journey of covering all sorts of historical facts. They go back to Aristotle and how ancient Greeks looked at wealth. They mentioned that That's why Aristotle, for instance, argued that wealth should be sought only for the sake of living virtuously, to manage a household, say, or to participate in the life of the city. Here, wealth is useful, but not inherently good. Indeed, Aristotle specifically warned that the accumulation of wealth for its own sake corrupts virtue instead of enabling it. So it's very interesting that these authors, who are certainly not looking at it from a biblical or Christian perspective, sort of arrived at this conclusion that the scriptures sort of allude to regarding what is the objective that we have in building wealth and accumulating assets. And you know, wealth can be a phenomenal tool to accomplish many things. But when it comes an end in and of itself, when there is no purpose besides just accumulating toys, that's where things start getting interesting. And it influences your mind, your psyche, how you interact with people is very fascinating. If you keep going into this article and look at some of the other things that the authors are sharing, it's so interesting to hear behaviorally how having money can affect your thought process. They quote that those Mercedes and Lexuses, referring to people who drive luxury vehicles, are more likely to cut you off than Hondas and Fords. Studies have shown that people who drive expensive cars are more prone to run stop signs and to cut off other motorists. It's really interesting that they talk about this because part of the point of the article that they want to bring up is that wealth and money can make you feel a sense of entitlement to be treated differently, and that the rules don't apply to you, that you can get away with things that you wouldn't otherwise get away because you have means. And the author in this particular case is not wrong. If you're a driver and there's a particular brand that has some stigma associated with its drivers and the way that they aggressively drive down the road. I'm not going to mention that brand, but you probably know which brand I'm talking about. Personally, a few years ago, I actually used to drive, a luxury vehicle, and believe it or not, I was I was much younger, immature, and being behind the wheel of that car, I made some poor decisions, and it's just kind of like it affects sort of like your optics when you're in the middle of that situation. So I'll be the first one to confess that this absolutely 100% applied to me. Now, thankfully, I've grown and matured out of those early 20 years when I was, in that situation. But it certainly left me a reminder when I was looking at this article and thinking about, what I was going through in that stage of my life. They actually go on and say that the studies also find that members of the upper class, again, however they want to define that, I'm not entirely sure, but are worse than ordinary folks at reading people's emotions and are far more likely to be disengaged from the people with whom they are interacting, instead absorbed in doodling, checking their phone, or whatever other activity distracts them from maintaining eye contact and having a conversation with people. Some studies go even further, suggesting that rich people, especially stockbrokers, and I feel sad because this is starting to get into the territory of my colleagues, my peers in the industry, right? Stockbrokers and their ilk, such as venture capitalists, whom we once called robber barons, are more competitive, impulsive, and reckless than medically diagnosed psychopaths. And honestly, of course, there is a lot of drama in this writing. This is absolutely, in large part, an opinion piece by the authors. And I think they did a good job at, sort of getting the emotional reaction that they wanted from people. And by the way, that is not an indictment on everyone in the financial services industry. There's many people, stockbrokers, venture capitalists, financial advisors that are good people, that do a good job and are not reckless and 100% are not psychopaths. But apparently that's what the authors of this article chose to highlight about, my part of the industry, so to speak. And as I look at this article and I looked at some of those things that applied to myself in a prior life, I don't think this article is entirely off base. Sure, it's a little bit dramatic, and I would rather they would have stuck a little bit more to the facts instead of injecting so much opinion into it. But the truth is that part of what they're saying is true. Wealth tends to at times change your behavior, your psychology, the way you treat other people. And it's very easy to finish this article and to finish the prior biblical reading that we had from 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting in verse 6, and walk away and be like, okay, yeah, wealth is a bad thing. Money's going to destroy you. You need to walk away from this thing. But we're getting to the point in the conversation where we're going to look at a different angle on this topic, because that's certainly where the reading and the article that we've done has taken us to. But I do think that there are some very interesting examples in the scriptures, particularly of people who were gifted, blessed, and given significant amount of wealth, yet they reacted differently when it came to testing their character and reacting and the outcomes that they yielded in their life. And I think that's why it's so important that we look at this subject from different angles, because I don't want you to walk away from this stream thinking that money in and of itself is poison. That is not true. But it's certainly something that you should be careful about, and we should analyze and inspect the people who have been really successful with it and have a faithful life, and people who were unsuccessful at managing it and that wealth crushed them. So let's look at a couple of examples. My favorite character in the Bible is Abraham. Abraham is all around a phenomenal patriarch, right? Successful, very smart, very diplomatic, well respected in his time, a fighter when he had to fight, a keeper of the peace when he had to as well. Now, don't get me wrong, Abraham was not a perfect man. He was also a liar, and he did things in less than honorable ways in some points in his life. But when you look at the New Testament, right, way after, thousands of years after Abraham's time, the net of Abraham's life was very positive. It was actually spoken of him as one of the main foundations of the faith, as a man who believed God, and God granted him righteousness on account of that faith. But what's interesting about Abraham is that Abraham was also very rich. If you look at Genesis chapter 13, verse 2, it's kind of, smack in the middle of Abraham's story. And it says that now Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. So Abraham's wealth came primarily from ranching. He had all kinds of animals, big herds at that. And he also had a lot of physical metal, precious metal wealth, which was the primary store of value other than livestock in the ancient world. So Abraham could be accounted for, we don't have an estimation of what his net worth would be today, but we can say that Abraham was definitely not middle class. Abraham was very wealthy and had a lot of possessions. Very rich man. We have another great example, which is actually his son, Isaac. Again, another flawed man who made a lot of mistakes, but on a net basis was someone who was credited to be a righteous man on account of his faith in God. And in Genesis 26, so about 13 chapters after this reference of Abraham is made, now Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. So Isaac planted and reaped 100 times what he planted. Definitely miraculous. And the Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and continued to grow richer until he became very wealthy. So both Abraham and Isaac, patriarchs of the people of Israel, key characters in the Old Testament in this history of the people of God, both were endowed with incredible amounts of money, possessions, very large families, and also a lot of people that served them. So Abraham and Isaac probably would fit the archetype of what we think today as the wealthy. Yet, at the end of their life, even though they were flawed and they failed in many ways, they were counted as righteous. And we don't often talk about the examples of people who actually achieved success, who gained wealth, but were actually righteous people whose wealth never destroyed them, never shook their confidence in God. As a matter of fact, the character flaws that Abraham and Isaac had less to do with their wealth and more to do with other things going on in their life, in their family, the interactions with the people they had around them. So there's no mention in the Bible that wealth in and of itself was any problem to these two men, even though they were flawed sinners, just like all of us are. But let's look at the other side of that coin. How about people that were given incredible amounts of wealth in the Bible and failed to be good stewards, failed to be faithful people and to be righteous people? Well, let's look at the example of Solomon, one of the greatest kings that Israel had. His father had created a peace with his neighbors through war. Solomon was blessed with tremendous peace, a significant amount of wealth, and above all, being the wisest man alive. This all happened when Solomon was very young. So he spent the majority of his life ruling a country. And remember, unlike today, where we have to have people campaign all over the country and winning an election, in those days, you were born into this. So Solomon did not work a single dime that he inherited from his father, let alone the crown that was put on his head when his father was about to pass. And Solomon, in a lot of ways, it was in such an enviable position for all of us. But unfortunately, Solomon was caught in a lot of character flaws, and his wealth actually and his power became an obstacle in his relationship with God. So he got tribute from other kingdoms. He was accounted to have 40,000 stalls for horses, for chariots, and 12,000 horsemen. Silver was so common in Israel that it became worthless because there was also a ton of gold. So when people see this outpouring of wealth, silver is looking like a piece of rock. Nobody actually wants to touch it because there's so much gold floating around this society and so much prosperity that people are happy to have access to this new wealth creation period. But oh boy, did Solomon have an interesting end to his life. Despite being one of the wisest men alive, his wealth, his power, his position consumed him. He started engaging in political marriages with his neighboring nations, which God explicitly forbid in the law. So he deviated from that. He got really caught into all the political alliances and an intrigue and the diplomacy and all these fancy things that he had access to. And what ended up happening was that he moved away from the law because of all these things that he had around him. And those things ended up consuming him to the point that at the end of his life, he allowed many of his wives to have idols and high places at that, which were detestable to the Lord. And he himself also engaged in those activities. What a fall. What a precipitous fall from glory, from having everything, power, youth, money, and letting all of that get to you and forgetting who gave it all to you. How about this other example, the young man or the young ruler, depending on your Bible translation? And here's why I'm bringing a New Testament example, because I know many of you are listening to this like, okay, let's get to the New Testament. The Old Testament is the boring stuff. Well, Jesus had an encounter with a young man who also is described as a young ruler, presumably somebody who inherited his wealth, somebody that had a substantial amount of money in the society at the time. And when he came into a conversation with Jesus, Jesus challenged him because in his mind, this young ruler or this young man had done everything he needed to do in order to fulfill the commandments. So Jesus has an interesting exchange with him, which I would recommend you go read, is in Matthew chapter 19. But for the purposes of our conversation right now, I'm just going to highlight the exchange that ended this conversation between him and Jesus. Jesus said to him, if you wish to be complete, go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me. And here's the last thing we hear about the young man. But when the young man heard this statement, he went away grieving, for he was one who owned much property. You see, the message that we got from this exchange with Jesus is that the young man loved his possessions and loved his money way more than he loved the idea of following Jesus. He knew that Jesus was the real deal. He knew that this challenge would mean he would have to get rid of all of the comforts of his life to go follow him. And in that conversation, he decided to walk away because he just could not bear the possibility of parting away with his possessions. Now, maybe he came around later on. We don't know because it's not documented in the Bible. We don't know if he came around and actually sold everything he had and ended up accepting Jesus and following him. But what we do know is that he represents another clear example of someone who was too distracted by material possessions and ultimately did not answer the right call in his life to do the right thing. And that, my friends, is the key takeaway for tonight. Yes, there are dangers to money. There are dangers to wealth. Wealth is very powerful, and in the wrong hands, it can do a lot of damage, but in the right hands, it can do a lot of good. And money in and of itself is not the issue. It's the condition of your soul that matters. We saw examples of two men who were endowed with incredible wealth, but the condition of their heart was such that that wealth did not distract them from the ultimate goal. But then on the other hand, we saw two men who were equally or perhaps even more wealthy, but because their heart was not in the right place, the wealth consumed them. The wealth made them make those bad decisions because wealth tends to warp our perception of reality. Wealth magnifies what's inside of us. If you're a good charitable person, wealth is going to make you into a philanthropist. If you're selfish and scared and scarce, wealth is only going to magnify those traits that people really don't like about you. And that's the truth. And that's why it's so important for us to have a healthy relationship with money and possessions. Now, you may be asking yourself, oh boy, I am in trouble. What do I do? What are some ways in which I can change this trend in my life and make sure that I'm guarding my heart against the damages that I can avoid by not engaging in this path? Well, the first thing I would encourage you to do is to evaluate your lifestyle and determine how attached you are to it. Are you so attached to your lifestyle that your comfort comes first before serving others? Are you so attached to your lifestyle that you could not possibly see yourself in a situation where you didn't live in that beautiful house or you didn't drive the beautiful car? Maybe you can't stand the idea of not going on vacation. Maybe there's a sense of entitlement in your heart that's making you hold so tight that you don't leave room for God. So think about that. Think about how your lifestyle may be a clear indicator of where your heart is. Now, the second thing I will challenge you to do is to implement a disciplined giving program. When I work with clients and with people that have amassed a significant amount of assets, One of the key ingredients that I've seen in people that are very successful at storing money, and we're not talking about people with 2 or 3 million. We're talking about people with 20, 40, 50 million, even more money than that. They keep themselves grounded because they know that the money that they have does not belong to them. So they have set themselves up in their lives with certain, call it circuit breakers, planned ways of giving that reminds them constantly that whether life is going good or whether life is going not so good, they're always engaging in giving their resources for the good of other people. If you don't have a structured giving program, if you find yourself having a lot of possessions, a structured giving program can give you that escape valve to know that, hey, this money may be in your hands, but it's not actually yours. And that is actually what's going to lead me to that third point that I want you to remember. And it's that we are stewards. As stewards, we deserve our pay. As stewards, we deserve to enjoy the fruit of our labor. But as stewards, we're not the owners of it all. God is. And if you infuse that mindset, that thinking into the way that you manage your wealth, whether it's your small IRA with $50,000 or your 401k after retiring with $3 million, or your family's trust with 20, 30, 50, $100 million, it doesn't matter what level you do that. You have to remember that we are in this earth to be stewards of creation, stewards of the things and the gifts that God has given us. Don't feel guilty about achieving success. Don't feel guilty about having a substantial amount of assets. Start thinking about ways to deploy those assets for the good of others, for the betterment of your family, for the betterment of your neighborhood, of your city, of your church, of the kingdom. And if you haven't amassed that amount of money, also check your heart. If your first reaction about wealth is that wealth is evil and rich people are bad people, it is very unlikely that you will achieve any level of success, financially speaking, in your life. And if you look at the opportunities that you can have to serve God by being faithful, disciplined, and applying biblical principles of managing money, you will realize that God can also use you, even though you have very little now. He can use you to not only give along the way, but also be a transformational character, figure, person, man, woman in your neighborhood, in your city, in your family. So I hope this conversation was helpful to give you a different lens in this conversation that we as a society are having about the role of money and how it can impact our hearts. I was wondering if you had any thoughts or comments before we wrap up the conversation. I have the chat open. William Jensen, thank you so much for your comment about this. Some of these insights being great. Are there any other thoughts, any questions that you may have about this subject that may be burning thoughts for you right now? I'd love to hear them. When you look at these conversations, also think about how you can engage your friends, your family about these topics. If you love this type of conversation, give it a like, subscribe to our YouTube channel, join our Abundant Money group to be in the loop with everything that we're producing. And, would love to hear from you. So send us your thoughts, send us your feedback, send us other conversations you want to have with us. I hope you have a wonderful and a blessed evening and that you enjoyed the conversation that we had tonight.